3 minutes before a room full of millionaires fell silent. Nobody even knew the little boy's name. They saw the crystal chandeliers, the tailored suits, the polished marble floors, and the cameras waiting to capture another successful night for Caldwell Industries. They saw power, influence, and wealth. What they didn't see was an 8-year-old boy standing near the entrance, gripping his mother's hand so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. His name was Noah Parker, and crowded rooms like this felt less like celebrations and more like storms. His mother, Olivia, had almost turned around twice before walking into the Grand Lexington Ballroom in downtown Chicago. She knew these events weren't designed for children like Noah, but a local charity had invited families to attend, and she had promised herself she would keep trying to give her son experiences beyond the careful routines of everyday life. Across the room, Ethan Caldwell, the 39-year-old CEO whose name appeared on the building itself, was shaking hands and greeting donors. Everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. The evening was supposed to showcase generosity, leadership, and opportunity. Then something changed. At first it was subtle. Noah's breathing became quicker. His eyes darted from one flashing camera to another. The sound of hundreds of conversations blended into a wall of noise that seemed to press against him from every direction. Olivia immediately recognized the signs. She knelt beside him and spoke softly, trying to guide him through the anxiety. For a moment, it looked like it might work. Then another burst of applause erupted from the center of the ballroom. Noah covered his ears. His body stiffened. Olivia's heart sank. She knew the feeling of helplessness that followed. Around them, guests began to notice. Conversations slowed. Curious glances turned into stares. Some people looked sympathetic. Others looked uncomfortable. Olivia tried everything that usually helped. She spoke gently. She offered reassurance. She reminded Noah that they could leave whenever he wanted. But the overwhelming environment had already taken hold. The elegant atmosphere of the gala suddenly felt fragile, as though everyone was waiting for someone else to solve a problem they didn't understand. Heavily in her voice. "I do not know," she admitted. "Sometimes he just needs time." Ethan nodded, though the answer left him feeling powerless. Throughout his career, problems came with strategies, resources, and measurable solutions. This situation offered none of those things. Several guests began making suggestions. One woman mentioned a pediatric specialist she knew. Another recommended a behavioral therapist who worked with children across Illinois. Within minutes, phones appeared in hands. Calls were being made. Contacts were being shared. The room had transformed into an impromptu effort to help Noah. Yet despite everyone's good intentions, nothing changed. Noah remained overwhelmed, disconnected from the world around him. Ethan felt the pressure growing. The longer the situation continued, the more uncomfortable the atmosphere became. Finally, acting on instinct rather than strategy, he stepped onto the small stage and took the microphone. The room quieted immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "If anyone here can help this young man feel safe and calm tonight, I am personally offering $750,000. A collective murmur swept through the crowd. Some people looked stunned. Others seemed inspired by the challenge. Within moments, several volunteers approached. A child psychologist attending the gala tried speaking softly to Noah. Nothing changed. A renowned therapist carefully introduced herself. Noah did not respond. Another specialist attempted a technique she had successfully used with dozens of children. Still nothing. One after another, respected professionals stepped forward. One after another, they quietly stepped back. Olivia watched the scene unfold with mixed emotions. She appreciated every effort, but each failed attempt deepened her sadness. Noah was not a puzzle to solve. He was her son. Across the room, the elderly janitor remained exactly where he had been from the beginning. He never approached the stage. He never joined the crowd. Yet something unusual happened. Every few moments, Noah's eyes drifted back toward him. And when the janitor finally noticed this, a shadow of recognition crossed his face. The expression disappeared from Samuel Brooks's face almost as quickly as it had appeared, but Olivia noticed it. So did Ethan. The elderly janitor lowered his eyes for a moment, as though he were debating something with himself. Around him, guests continued discussing solutions, exchanging business cards, and offering recommendations. No one paid much attention to the man holding a mop near the service hallway. He seemed invisible compared to the executives, specialists, and donors filling the ballroom. Yet Noah continued glancing in his direction. Every few seconds, his eyes returned to Samuel. Ethan noticed the pattern and quietly walked across the room. "Sir," he said politely, "have you met the boy before?" Samuel looked surprised by the question. "No, sir," he replied. "I have never seen him in my life." Ethan studied him carefully. There was no hesitation in the answer. "Then why do you think he keeps looking at you?" Samuel glanced toward Noah. The boy was still overwhelmed, but his attention remained fixed on the janitor more than anyone else in the room. Samuel released a slow breath. "I'm not sure," he said. "Maybe he sees something familiar." Ethan frowned. The answer seemed vague, yet something about the man's tone felt sincere. Before Ethan could respond, one of the event organizers approached. She lowered her voice. "The guests are getting restless. The schedule is completely off track." Ethan nodded but kept his attention on Samuel. "Do you have experience working with children?" he asked. Samuel hesitated. "A long time ago." Ethan waited for more, but none came. Across the ballroom, Olivia remained beside Noah, whose breathing had become slightly steadier even though he still seemed trapped inside the overwhelming environment. She followed his gaze and once again found Samuel standing near Ethan. It made no sense. Specialists with advanced degrees had failed to reach her son. Wealthy donors had offered assistance. Experienced therapists had tried every technique they knew. Yet Noah seemed interested only in the quiet janitor nobody had noticed before tonight. One of the guests suddenly approached Samuel. With an amused smile. "You are not thinking about claiming that reward, are you?" Several nearby people chuckled softly. Samuel simply shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Good," another guest added. "The professionals could not do it." Samuel did not appear offended. If anything, he seemed accustomed to being underestimated. Ethan watched the exchange and felt unexpectedly uncomfortable. The man had been treated more like part of the furniture than part of the event. Yet throughout the evening, Samuel had remained calm, while everyone else grew increasingly anxious. Then something unexpected happened. Noah slowly loosened his grip on his mother's sleeve. It was a small movement, so small that most people missed it. Olivia did not. Her eyes widened immediately. For nearly 20 minutes, Noah had been holding on tightly. Now, for the first time, he seemed focused on something beyond his distress. His attention remained fixed on Samuel. The elderly janitor noticed the change too. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Samuel's expression softened. And in that moment, he made a decision that would change the course of the entire evening. Samuel set the mop carefully against the wall and began walking across the ballroom. The movement was so unexpected that several conversations stopped immediately. Guests watched him with curiosity. A few exchanged puzzled looks. One of the event coordinators stepped forward as if to stop him, but Ethan raised a hand. "Let him through," he said quietly. Samuel nodded in appreciation and continued toward Noah. He moved slowly, without urgency, as though he understood that rushing would only make things worse. Olivia felt her pulse quicken. Part of her wanted to protect her son from yet another well-meaning stranger. Another part of her could not ignore what she had already seen. Noah had noticed this man before anyone else. Samuel stopped a few feet away and looked toward Olivia rather than Noah. "May I sit down?" he asked. His voice was gentle and respectful. Olivia hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Okay." Instead of standing over the boy, Samuel lowered himself into a chair nearby. Then, after a few seconds, he slid from the chair and sat on the floor. The action surprised everyone. Expensive suits and evening gowns filled the ballroom, yet the elderly janitor calmly sat on polished marble as though none of it mattered. More importantly, he placed himself at Noah's eye level. He did not ask questions. He did not offer instructions. He simply waited. The room grew quieter than it had been all evening. Even the guests near the back seemed unwilling to disturb the moment. Noah continued breathing heavily, but his eyes remained fixed on Samuel. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Then Samuel leaned forward slightly. He did not reach out. He did not attempt to touch the boy. Instead, he whispered a single word so softly that almost nobody else could hear it. "Buddy." The reaction was immediate. Noah blinked. Once, then twice. The tension in his shoulders eased. The frantic movement of his eyes slowed. Olivia stared in disbelief. She had heard countless specialists use carefully selected phrases over the years. She had listened to experts explain methods, strategies, and communication techniques. Yet one simple word from a stranger had accomplished what none of those efforts had achieved tonight. Samuel remained completely still. He did not celebrate. He did not speak again. He simply waited. Noah took a slow breath. Then another. For the first time since entering the ballroom, he seemed present. Truly present. Around them, people looked at one another as if they were afraid to acknowledge what they had just witnessed. Ethan could hardly believe it himself. $750,000 had attracted some of the most qualified people in the room. None had succeeded. Yet this quiet man had changed everything in less than 10 seconds. Olivia felt tears gathering in her eyes. Not because Noah was suddenly cured. Not because every challenge had disappeared. But because she had just watched her son find a moment of peace when it seemed impossible. Then something even more unexpected happened. Noah slowly lifted his hand and pointed toward Samuel. The elderly janitor's expression changed instantly. It was not surprise. It was recognition. And when Samuel saw what Noah was trying to show him, the color drained from his face. Everyone followed Noah's gaze. The little boy was no longer looking at Samuel's face. He was pointing at something hanging from a thin chain around the janitor's neck. Until that moment, it had remained hidden beneath his work shirt. As Samuel shifted slightly, the small silver pendant had become visible. The elderly man's eyes widened the instant he realized what Noah had noticed. For a few seconds, he simply stared at the boy. Then, very carefully, he pulled the pendant into view. It was an ordinary piece of silver, worn smooth by years of use. To most people in the ballroom, it meant nothing. But Noah's attention locked onto it immediately. Olivia could hardly believe what she was seeing. Her son was calm. More than calm. He seemed curious, interested, connected. Emotions she rarely saw emerge in unfamiliar environments were suddenly appearing before her eyes. Samuel looked down at the pendant and gently turned it in his fingers. On one side was a small engraved drawing of a lighthouse. The image seemed simple, but something about it held Noah's attention completely. The boy slowly extended a hand toward it. Samuel glanced at Olivia for permission. She nodded. Samuel carefully allowed Noah to touch the pendant. The ballroom remained silent. Hundreds of people watched without speaking. Noah traced the outline of the lighthouse with a fingertip. Then, to everyone's surprise, he looked directly into Samuel's eyes. Olivia felt tears slipping down her cheeks. Eye contact had never been impossible for Noah, but moments like this were rare, especially during periods of stress. Yet here he was, calmly sitting in a crowded ballroom, focused entirely on a man he had met only minutes earlier. Ethan stood nearby, unable to look away. He had built companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had negotiated deals that shaped entire industries. Yet nothing in his professional life had prepared him for the quiet power of this moment. "What is the pendant?" he finally asked. Samuel remained focused on Noah for several seconds before answering. "It belonged to my son." The words seemed to settle over the room. Ethan noticed a subtle change in Samuel's expression. Beneath the calm exterior was something deeper. A sadness carried for many years. Olivia heard it too. "Your son?" she asked softly. Samuel nodded. He loved lighthouses. Noah continued examining the pendant as though he understood its importance. Samuel swallowed hard before speaking again. He carried this drawing everywhere. The janitor's voice remained steady, but his eyes reflected memories he had not expected to revisit tonight. Ethan sensed there was far more to the story than Samuel was revealing. So did Olivia. Something about the way he looked at Noah felt personal, familiar, not because he knew the boy, but because he knew the journey, the struggles, the fears, the victories nobody else noticed. Then Noah did something that left the entire ballroom speechless. He reached for a nearby notepad sitting on a registration table, picked up a pen, and began to draw. And when Samuel saw the image slowly appearing on the paper, he stopped breathing for a moment because it was the exact same lighthouse his son used to draw. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Noah continued drawing while the entire ballroom watched. His hand moved with a confidence that had not been visible all evening. Line after line appeared across the paper until the image became unmistakable. A lighthouse stood on a rocky shoreline beneath a sky filled with stars. It was simple, but it carried details that made Samuel's heart ache. The angle of the tower, the shape of the windows, even the small flag near the top. They were details he had seen hundreds of times before. details that belonged to memories he had spent years trying to carry without breaking. Samuel lowered his eyes. "That is impossible," he whispered. Ethan stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Samuel looked at the drawing again before answering. "My son used to draw this exact lighthouse." Several people exchanged confused glances. Olivia looked from the drawing to Samuel. "Maybe it is a coincidence." Samuel wanted to agree. He truly did. But something deep inside him refused to accept that explanation. "Maybe," he said softly. "But there is more." Noah paused his drawing and gently tapped the paper twice. Samuel immediately recognized the gesture. It was small and subtle, yet it sent a chill through him. His son had done the same thing whenever he wanted someone to pay attention to a specific part of a drawing. Samuel stared at the paper. Near the bottom of the lighthouse, Noah had added a tiny bench facing the ocean. Samuel felt emotion rise in his chest. His son had always drawn that bench. Always. Ethan noticed the change in the older man's face. "Tell us about him," he said quietly. Samuel remained silent for a moment. Then he nodded. The ballroom seemed to disappear around him. "His name was Caleb," he began. "He was 8 years old when he first became fascinated with lighthouses." Olivia listened carefully. Noah remained calm beside Samuel, almost as though he wanted to hear the story too. Caleb saw patterns in things most people ignored. He noticed sounds, colors, and details that the rest of us missed. Sometimes the world overwhelmed him. Sometimes it felt too loud, too bright, too fast. Olivia felt tears forming again because every word sounded familiar. Samuel smiled faintly. Most people never understood him, but he understood far more than they realized. Ethan noticed that several guests who had been impatient earlier were now completely absorbed. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody talked. Samuel continued. When Caleb found something that made him feel safe, he held on to it. For him, that was the lighthouse. He used to tell me that lighthouses stayed calm during storms. Samuel stopped speaking for a moment and looked at Noah. The little boy was studying the drawing with complete focus. "That is why I called him Buddy," Samuel said. "Whenever the world became too much, I would sit beside him and remind him that he was safe." Olivia suddenly understood why that single word had worked. It had not been a technique. It had not been a strategy. It had come from years of love, patience, and experience. Then Ethan asked the question everyone was thinking. "Where is Caleb now?" The smile faded from Samuel's face, and a deep sadness settled into his eyes. Samuel lowered his eyes to the floor before answering. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that evening. Even the distant sounds from the hotel seemed to fade away. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of years. "Caleb passed away 12 years ago." No one moved. Olivia instinctively placed a hand over her heart. Ethan looked down for a moment, unsure what to say. Samuel had not spoken those words aloud to strangers in a very long time. "He was 16, Samuel continued. "He spent his whole life teaching me how to see the world differently." A faint smile appeared on his face. "Most people thought I was taking care of him. The truth is, he was teaching me every day." Noah remained seated beside him, quietly holding the drawing. Samuel glanced toward the boy and continued. Caleb noticed things that everyone else missed. He could walk into a room and sense when someone was sad before they said a word. He could remember tiny details years after everyone else forgot them. He taught me patience. He taught me kindness. He taught me that being different is not the same as being broken. Olivia felt tears running down her cheeks. For years, she had fought against assumptions about her son. People often focused on what Noah could not do instead of seeing everything he could. Hearing Samuel describe Caleb felt like hearing someone describe the future she hoped her son might have. Ethan listened carefully. The story stirred something uncomfortable inside him. Throughout the evening, he had treated the situation like a problem that needed solving. He had offered money, resources, expertise, yet the breakthrough had come from something entirely different. It had come from understanding. Samuel looked around the ballroom. "After Caleb passed away, I spent a long time angry at the world." His voice softened. "Then one day I realized something. The greatest gift he left behind was not sadness. It was perspective." Several guests lowered their eyes. The words seemed directed at everyone in the room. "So I stopped asking why life had been unfair. I started asking how I could honor him." Samuel glanced at the mop still resting near the hallway. "That is why I work where people gather. Every day, I get the chance to be kind to someone. Most people never notice. But sometimes that is enough. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He thought about the thousands of employees who worked for him. The meetings. The reports. The profits. Suddenly those things felt less important than they had an hour earlier. Beside Samuel, Noah carefully folded the drawing and held it against his chest. Then he looked up at the older man with an expression of trust that seemed impossible given how the evening had begun. Samuel smiled gently, but as his eyes settled on Noah's face, a look of surprise crossed his features. There was something else he had just remembered. Something connected to a hospital, a waiting room, and a frightened young mother he had met years ago. And the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that tonight was not the first time their paths had crossed. Samuel could not take his eyes off Olivia. The memory had arrived suddenly, surfacing from a place he had not visited in years. At first it was only a feeling. Then details began returning one by one. A hospital corridor. A rainy afternoon. A young mother sitting alone with a sleeping child in her arms. Samuel leaned forward slightly. "Olivia," he said carefully, "have you ever been to St. Matthew Children's Hospital?" Olivia looked surprised by the question. "Of course," she answered. "Many times." Samuel nodded slowly. "About 7 years ago, during a storm. Were you sitting near the pediatric evaluation wing?" Olivia stared at him. The ballroom seemed to disappear around her. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was." Samuel felt his chest tighten. "I thought so." Ethan watched the exchange, completely absorbed. Olivia searched Samuel's face, trying to understand. "How could you possibly remember that?" Samuel smiled faintly. "Because you were crying." The honesty of the answer caught everyone off guard. "You were trying very hard not to let anyone see it," he continued. "But I noticed." Olivia lowered her eyes. The memory came rushing back. Noah had recently received a difficult diagnosis. She had spent months feeling overwhelmed, frightened, and completely alone. "I worked maintenance at the hospital back then," Samuel said. "I was fixing a light fixture outside the waiting area." Olivia slowly nodded as pieces began fitting together. Samuel continued. "You looked exhausted, like the weight of the world was sitting on your shoulders." Olivia remembered the day perfectly now. She remembered thinking no one saw her. No one noticed. No one understood. Samuel reached into his pocket and removed a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age from being carried for years. He unfolded it carefully. Inside was a simple drawing of a lighthouse. Olivia stared at it. "Caleb drew that," Samuel explained. "That same afternoon." Ethan looked between them, stunned. Samuel continued. "When Caleb saw you sitting there, he asked why the lady looked sad." Samuel smiled at the memory. "I told him I did not know." He glanced down at Noah. "Then Caleb drew this lighthouse and asked me to give it to you." Olivia covered her mouth. Tears streamed freely down her face now. "The lighthouse," she whispered. "I still have it." Samuel's eyes widened. "You kept it?" Olivia nodded. "It is in a memory box at home." The room fell silent once again. Years earlier, a boy named Caleb had tried to comfort a stranger he never met. Now, somehow, that stranger's son sat calmly beside Caleb's father. Ethan felt chills run through him. The coincidence seemed almost impossible. Yet the deeper truth was even more powerful. A small act of kindness from years ago had never disappeared. It had quietly traveled through time, connecting lives in ways none of them could have imagined. Then Noah carefully unfolded his drawing and pointed to the bench beside the lighthouse. When Samuel saw where Noah's finger rested, tears filled his eyes because written beside the bench was a single word that Noah had never written before. Samuel stared at the word written beside the bench. His hands trembled slightly as he looked from the drawing to Noah and back again. The word was Buddy. It was not written perfectly. The letters were uneven and shaky, but it was unmistakable. Olivia looked at the page and froze. She knew exactly how significant that moment was. Noah rarely wrote words, especially in unfamiliar environments surrounded by strangers. Yet there it was, resting beside the lighthouse and the bench Caleb had once loved to draw. Tears filled Samuel's eyes. For years he had carried memories of his son wherever he went. He had learned to live with the silence that remained after Caleb was gone. Yet somehow, on a night that had begun with confusion and heartbreak, he felt that silence soften. Noah carefully held the drawing out to him. Samuel accepted it as though it were something priceless. Ethan watched the exchange and felt a realization settle deep within him. All evening he had believed the answer would come from resources, expertise, or money. Instead, the answer had come from compassion, patience, and a connection no one could have predicted. He stepped forward and looked at Samuel. "The offer still stands," he said quietly. $750,000. It is yours. Samuel immediately shook his head. "No." Ethan blinked in surprise. "You earned it." Samuel smiled gently. "I did not do this for money." Ethan had negotiated with some of the toughest business leaders in America, but he could tell there would be no changing the older man's mind. "Then tell me what you want." Samuel glanced at Noah and Olivia. Then he looked around the ballroom, filled with people who had witnessed everything. "There are families everywhere who feel alone," he said. "Parents who need support. Children who need understanding. If you really want to help, build something for them." The room fell silent once again. Ethan nodded slowly. For the first time that evening, he knew exactly what he needed to do. 1 year later, the Samuel Brooks Family Resource Center opened its doors on the north side of Chicago. The center provided support programs, community services, and educational resources for families raising children with unique communication needs. Ethan funded the project personally. Samuel served as an advisor. Olivia volunteered there every month. And Noah became one of the first children to participate in its programs. Near the entrance stood a framed drawing protected behind glass. Visitors often stopped to admire the simple lighthouse beside the ocean. Most never knew the full story behind it. Beneath the drawing was a small plaque containing a single sentence. It read, "One act of kindness can travel farther than you ever imagine." Samuel passed that display every week. Each time he smiled, not because it reminded him of loss, but because it reminded him of what Caleb had taught him long ago. People do not always need someone to fix them. Sometimes they simply need someone willing to sit beside them until the storm passes. And on a night when nobody else knew what to do, that simple truth changed everything.